The first orange notice was taped to my front door on a Tuesday morning, flapping mockingly in the suburban breeze. It wasn't a friendly welcome to the neighborhood card or a flyer for a local bake sale. It was a formal citation of architectural noncompliance from the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association. The offense? My mailbox was apparently 3 shades darker than the approved ivory mandated in the 400-page HOA bylaws. My name is David, and 3 months ago, I moved into this quiet, upscale cul-de-sac in the hills of Pennsylvania seeking nothing but peace, quiet, and a place to focus on my work as a senior civil engineer and land surveyor. I had spent 15 years working on massive infrastructure projects, and I just wanted a house with a decent yard and no drama. But Oakwood Heights had a self-appointed queen, and her name was Brenda. Brenda lived in the sprawling, overly manicured mansion directly across the street from me, and she didn't just run the HOA, she weaponized it. Within my first 90 days, Brenda had hit me with over $6,000 in arbitrary fines. First, it was the grass she claimed it was 3.1 inches tall when the limit was 3. Then, it was the unauthorized placement of a bird feeder. Then it was the color of my curtains, which she claimed were visible from the street and disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the block. I had tried to be the bigger person. I attended the monthly meetings, I spoke calmly, and I offered to make reasonable adjustments. But Brenda didn't want adjustments. She wanted total, humiliating submission. She was a suburban tyrant who spent her days patrolling the neighborhood in her white luxury SUV, looking for any excuse to exercise her pathetic amount of power. The situation escalated from annoying to life-altering on a Thursday afternoon when a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. He handed me a legal packet that made my blood run cold. Brenda hadn't just fined me. She had used a predatory clause in the HOA bylaws to place a lien on my property for unpaid environmental damages and systemic noncompliance. Because the fines had reached a certain threshold, the HOA was officially initiating a non-judicial foreclosure on my home. They weren't just trying to annoy me anymore. They were trying to legally steal my house. I sat in my darkened living room that night, the foreclosure papers spread out on my coffee table, and I felt a cold, calculated anger replace my initial shock. Brenda thought she was playing a game of suburban chess with a novice. She thought I was just some quiet bachelor who would fold under the pressure of a legal threat. What she didn't realize was that I didn't just build roads. I understood the very foundation of the earth we were standing on. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of absolute forensic obsession. I didn't call a lawyer immediately. Instead, I went to the county records office. I dug into the historical archives of the Oakwood Heights subdivision, going back 60 years to the original land grants. Oakwood Heights was built on an old estate that had been partitioned in the late 70s, and as I pored over the original topographical maps and the meets and bounds descriptions, I noticed a microscopic, recurring anomaly. There was a discrepancy in the original 1978 survey, a 4-degree variance in the primary boundary line that had been copied into every subsequent deed for the last 4 decades. I grabbed my professional-grade, high-precision laser surveying equipment from my garage and spent the middle of the night in my front yard, operating in the shadows. I wasn't just checking my fence line. I was re-establishing the absolute coordinates of the entire cul-de-sac based on the original master deed. As the sun began to rise on Friday morning, I stood on the edge of my property, looking across the street at Brenda's magnificent, overpriced mansion. I looked at the laser-etched coordinates on my digital display, and then I looked at the physical reality of the neighborhood. A slow, lethal smile spread across my face. According to the original, legally binding master survey from 1978, the boundary line didn't stop at the edge of the street. Due to a massive clerical error during the original partitioning, my property line actually extended 60 feet further across the cul-de-sac than anyone realized. I didn't just own my house and my yard. I owned 60% of the land Brenda's house was sitting on. Her entire master suite, her 3-car garage, and her prized heated swimming pool were all built on my private property. Brenda wasn't just my neighbor. She was a massive, illegal squatter on my land. And since she wanted to use property law to take my house, I decided right then and there that I was going to use property law to dismantle hers. The weekend following my discovery was spent in a state of meticulous, cold-blooded preparation. As a civil engineer, I knew that a discovery this massive couldn't be handled with a simple shouting match on a front porch. If I wanted to dismantle Brenda's suburban empire, I needed more than just my own measurements. I needed a certified, double-blind verification that would stand up in a high-stakes courtroom. I hired two of the most reputable, independent surveying firms in the state, firms that had no ties to our local county board or the HOA. I didn't tell them what I had found. I simply gave them the coordinates of the original 1978 iron pins and told them to perform a full boundary reconciliation for my lot. On Monday morning, while Brenda was likely peering through her curtains with a glass of expensive Chardonnay, watching for any visual infractions on my property, two teams of professional surveyors arrived. They spent 6 hours with high-grade GPS equipment, total stations, and ground-penetrating radar. By 4:00 p.m., both lead surveyors walked into my garage, looking pale and utterly confused. "David," the older one said, scratching his head while looking at his digital tablet. "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The 1978 deed partition for your lot wasn't just slightly off. It was a total clerical disaster. The primary boundary line doesn't terminate at the curb. It cuts an 80-foot diagonal across the entire cul-de-sac. According to the state-certified master map, you don't just own your yard. You own the asphalt of the street and approximately 40% of the structure built at 42 Oakwood Drive." 42 Oakwood Drive was Brenda's house. I thanked them, took their certified, notarized reports, and filed them into a thick leather binder. I spent the rest of the evening reading through the HOA's own bylaws, the same 400-page weapon Brenda had used to try and take my home. I found exactly what I was looking for in Section 14.2. Any structure, permanent or temporary, found to be encroaching upon private property or common areas without a prior written easement is subject to immediate removal at the owner's sole expense. Brenda had written that clause herself 5 years ago to force a neighbor to tear down a shed that was 2 inches over a property line. It was the ultimate poetic justice. On Tuesday morning, I didn't call Brenda. I didn't send an email. I waited for the monthly architectural review meeting at the community clubhouse. These meetings were Brenda's favorite pastime, a public stage where she could sit at a long table like a Supreme Court justice and hand out fines to neighbors for having the wrong shade of mulch. When I walked into the clubhouse, the room was packed with about 40 nervous residents. Brenda sat in the center, wearing a sharp power suit and an expression of smug, untouchable authority. When it was my turn to speak, she didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Mr. David," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, "I assume you're here to discuss the foreclosure proceedings. Unless you have a check for the $6,000 in outstanding fines, there's really nothing to talk about. The board has already voted." I didn't sit down. I walked to the front of the room and placed my leather binder on the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Actually, Brenda, I'm not here to talk about the fines," I said, my voice projecting clearly so every neighbor in the room could hear. "I'm here to discuss a massive architectural noncompliance issue at 42 Oakwood Drive. It seems there is a significant, unauthorized encroachment of a permanent structure on private property. According to HOA Section 14.2, which I believe you authored, that structure must be removed immediately." Brenda finally looked up, a mocking laugh escaping her lips. "My house, non-compliant. David, I have the most expensive landscaping and the most precise architectural plans in this county. You're delusional." I opened the binder and pulled out the 3 independent, certified surveys, sliding them across the table. "These are 3 separate state-certified boundary reconciliations based on the original 1978 master deed," I stated calmly. "They all confirm the same thing. Because of a 40-year-old surveying error that was never corrected, my property line extends 60 feet across the street. Your garage, your master suite, and your heated pool are all built on land that I legally own. You have no easement, no lease agreement, and no permission to be there. Brenda, you aren't just the HOA president. You are a squatter." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Brenda's face went from smug to confused, and then to a terrifying shade of ghostly white as she looked at the official red boundary lines on the maps. The neighbors began to whisper, the sound rising like a tidal wave. Brenda tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The suburban queen had just realized that her entire throne was built on someone else's dirt. "I'm giving you 24 hours to drop the foreclosure, zero out every fine in this neighborhood, and resign from the board," I said, leaning in close so only she could hear the ice in my voice. "Or on Friday morning, I'm bringing in a demolition crew to reclaim my land. And since I own the land, I'll be starting with your master bedroom." Brenda stared at me, the absolute terror finally reflecting in her eyes, realizing that the quiet neighbor she had tried to ruin was now the one holding the keys to her entire life. The 24-hour ultimatum I had delivered in the clubhouse didn't just rattle Brenda. It sent a shockwave through the entire Oakwood Heights ecosystem. By Wednesday night, the neighborhood group chats were in a state of absolute meltdown. People who had spent years living in fear of Brenda's orange citation notices were now sharing the certified survey maps I had provided, realizing that their queen was actually a colossal legal liability. But Brenda, true to her narcissistic nature, didn't spend that night preparing her resignation. Instead, she spent it in a state of frantic, delusional retaliation. At 8:00 a.m. on Thursday morning, while I was finishing my second cup of coffee, a black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man in a $3,000 suit, carrying a leather briefcase with the logo of one of the most aggressive corporate law firms in the state. He didn't knock. He rang the doorbell with the rhythm of someone who believed their time was worth more than my life. I opened the door, leaning against the frame, looking entirely unimpressed. "David?" the lawyer asked, his voice sharp and condescending. "I'm Miller, representing Mrs. Brenda and the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association. I have a court-ordered cease and desist here regarding your recent creative interpretations of the property lines. Furthermore, we are filing a $1 million defamation suit against you for the scene you caused at the clubhouse. My client is not a squatter, and your survey is nothing more than a desperate attempt to delay the foreclosure of your own home." I didn't even take the paper he was holding out. I simply adjusted my glasses and looked past him at Brenda, who was standing on her porch across the street, arms crossed, wearing a look of triumphant arrogance. She thought she had won. She thought the lawyer move was the end of the game. "Miller," I said, my voice calm and clinical. "I'm a civil engineer. I don't interpret lines. I establish them based on the immutable laws of physics and the state's historical land records. That cease and desist is legally worthless because you can't order a man to stop existing on his own land. Your client has spent the last 5 years using the HOA's budget to sue people for their mailbox colors, yet she failed to realize that the very documents she signed when she bought that mansion confirm the 1978 partition error." The lawyer started to interrupt, but I held up a hand. "I have already filed a quiet title action with the county court. I have also filed an emergency injunction to freeze the HOA's bank accounts, citing the illegal use of community funds to defend the personal property encroachment of a board member. But more importantly, Miller, look at my driveway." As if on cue, a massive flatbed truck from a commercial fencing company turned into the cul-de-sac, followed by a professional asphalt cutting crew. The neighbors began to emerge from their houses, sensing that the Cold War was about to turn into a hot one. Brenda's smug expression instantly vanished as the workers began unloading heavy-duty orange steel bollards and industrial-grade spray paint. "What are you doing?" the lawyer stammered, his professional mask finally cracking. "I am reclaiming my land," I announced, walking out into the street. I took a high-visibility laser level and set it on a tripod exactly on the 1978 iron pin marker. I clicked the power button, and a bright, lethal red line shot across the asphalt, perfectly bisecting Brenda's 3-car driveway and cutting directly through the center of her meticulously manicured rose garden. "According to the certified survey, everything to the north of this red line is my private property," I told the workers. "Cut the asphalt along the line. Install the bollards every 4 feet. If any structure, vehicle, or person crosses this line without my written permission, they are trespassing." Brenda let out a scream of pure, unadulterated rage and ran down her driveway. "You can't do this. This is my house. You're destroying my property," she shrieked, her face turning a terrifying shade of purple. I didn't look at her, I looked at the crew. "Proceed," I commanded. The sound of the industrial asphalt saw roared to life, a high-pitched scream of metal against stone that echoed through the hills. As the saw bit into the driveway Brenda had spent $50,000 to pave, a crowd of neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, some of them actually cheering. Brenda tried to throw herself in front of the machine, but the sheriff's deputy I had hired for private security intervention stepped forward and gently but firmly moved her back. "Ma'am, the survey is certified and a quiet title action is pending," the deputy said, his voice echoing with authority. "Mr. David has the legal right to secure his property until a judge says otherwise. I suggest you go inside and call your lawyer." Brenda stood there, defeated, as the saw cut a deep, irreversible trench right through the heart of her luxury life. Her master suite was now legally separated from her front door by a line of orange steel. The foreclosure she had initiated against me was officially dead, buried under the weight of her own stolen land. The physical barrier I had installed across Brenda's driveway was just the perimeter defense. The real offensive was happening in the digital and financial trenches. While Brenda was busy screaming at my orange steel bollards and crying to her increasingly frustrated legal team, I was utilizing my secondary expertise in forensic auditing. People often forget that a senior civil engineer on massive government projects has to understand more than just concrete and steel. We have to understand where every single cent of a $40 million budget goes. I knew that a woman like Brenda, who possessed such an pathological need for control, wouldn't stop at property lines. Her arrogance was likely a symptom of a much deeper, systemic corruption. As a dues-paying member of the Oakwood Heights HOA, I had a legal right to inspect the association's financial records. Under the threat of a secondary lawsuit for fiduciary non-transparency, I forced the HOA's management company to hand over 5 years of itemized bank statements, vendor contracts, and maintenance ledgers. I spent 3 days and 3 nights in my home office, surrounded by stacks of paper and 3 monitors running complex spreadsheet macros. What I found wasn't just bad accounting. It was a masterpiece of suburban embezzlement. Brenda had set up a series of ghost vendors, companies with generic names like Oakwood Precision Landscaping and Heights Exterior Maintenance. On paper, these companies were charging the HOA tens of thousands of dollars a year for premium mulch services and architectural consulting. But when I cross-referenced the business registration filings with the county database, the CEO of these vendors was Brenda's sister-in-law, and the registered business address was a P.O. box in a different county. Brenda was funneling the neighborhood's mandatory dues directly into her own pockets. She had used HOA funds to pay for the very heated pool that was currently sitting on my land. She had used the legal defense fund to pay for her private divorce attorney 3 years ago. She was literally using the neighbors' money to fund the lifestyle she used to look down on them. But the smoking gun was a secret reserve account that she had kept off the official annual reports. This account held nearly $200,000, and the last 3 withdrawals were made directly to the law firm she had hired to try and foreclose on my house. She was using the community's emergency funds to finance her personal vendetta against me. On Friday evening, I didn't send a private email. I used the neighborhood's emergency broadcast portal, a system Brenda had ironically set up to alert residents about grass height violations. I uploaded a comprehensive 15-page forensic audit report titled The State of Oakwood Heights, a report on systemic fraud. I included copies of the ghost vendor checks, the sister-in-law's registration papers, and the direct link between the HOA's reserve funds and her personal legal fees. I hit send all at exactly 6:00 p.m. Within 10 minutes, the cul-de-sac was no longer a quiet suburban street. It was a hornet's nest of righteous fury. Neighbors who had been paying $500 a month in dues were walking out of their houses, staring at their phones in absolute disbelief and growing rage. I walked out onto my porch and saw the lights flickering in Brenda's house. She was trapped behind my orange bollards, watching through her windows as the people she had bullied for a decade began to gather on the sidewalk, holding their phones like torches. The Queen of Oakwood Heights wasn't just losing her land, she was about to lose her freedom. The police sirens began to wail in the distance, but they weren't coming for me. A group of 4 board members, who had finally found their spines after seeing the evidence, had already called the district attorney's white-collar crime unit. As the blue and red lights reflected off the steel line I had drawn in the sand, I saw Brenda standing at her front door, clutching her silk robe, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She realized too late that when you try to ruin a man who builds foundations for a living, he will find every single crack in yours and bring the whole house down. The flashing blue and red lights of the district attorney's white-collar crime unit painted the cul-de-sac in the colors of justice. As the neighbors watched from their porches, Brenda was led out of her oversized front door in handcuffs. She wasn't wearing her designer power suit anymore. She was draped in a silk robe, her face pale and streaked with mascara-stained tears. She tried to scream about her rights and illegal harassment, but the lead detective simply held up the stack of ghost vendor checks and the forensic audit report I had provided. The evidence of her 5-year embezzlement scheme was so overwhelming that her high-priced lawyer refused to even show up at the precinct. Brenda's reign of terror was officially over, but my work wasn't finished. The legal battle for the land took another 3 months. With Brenda sitting in a county jail cell awaiting trial, the court finally ruled on my quiet title action. The judge, an old-school stickler for property law, was absolutely appalled by the 1978 survey error and Brenda's refusal to vacate my land. The final judgment was absolute. The state-certified survey was upheld. I legally owned the land beneath 40% of Brenda's house. Because Brenda was now bankrupt from legal fees and facing multiple felony counts of embezzlement and fraud, she couldn't afford to pay me the market value for the land she had stolen. I didn't want her money anyway. I wanted the foundation of my property to be clean. I exercised the removal clause in the HOA bylaws, the very same rule Brenda had used to bully neighbors for years. I hired a specialized architectural demolition crew. Under the supervision of a court-appointed marshal, they didn't tear down the whole house. They performed a surgical extraction. They cut directly along the red laser line I had drawn months ago. They demolished the 3-car garage, the master suite, and the heated pool. I watched from my porch as the excavators reclaimed my 60 feet of land, turning the symbol of Brenda's arrogance into a pile of rubble and dirt. Once the debris was cleared, the remaining 60% of Brenda's house, now a mangled, unsellable shell, was foreclosed upon by the bank. The Oakwood Heights HOA was officially dissolved by a majority vote of the residents. We replaced it with a simple neighborhood agreement that had exactly 2 pages and 0 fines. No more orange notices, no more mailbox inspections, just peace. I used my engineering expertise to landscape the reclaimed land into a beautiful, community access garden where neighbors could actually talk to each other without fear. Brenda eventually pleaded guilty to 3 counts of felony embezzlement and was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Her mansion was eventually leveled, and the lot remained empty, a permanent reminder to the neighborhood that no matter how high you build your throne, if the foundation is stolen, it will eventually collapse. My name is David. They tried to steal my house using a crooked HOA, so I found out they were living on my land and I took back every single inch. If you loved this massive suburban revenge story and the total downfall of a neighborhood Karen, you need to smash that like button and subscribe to the Revenge Room. We bring you the most satisfying, cold-blooded karma stories on the internet. Never let a bully intimidate you. Always check your property lines. And remember, sometimes the best way to fix a neighborhood is to draw a line in the sand. See you in the next one. The fall of Brenda was a massive victory for the neighborhood, but for a man like me, who spent his career navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of civil infrastructure, I knew the rot rarely stopped at the surface level. 2 weeks after the excavators had finished clearing the rubble from the northern 40% of Brenda's former lot, I received a visit that felt significantly more dangerous than a standard HOA citation. A black city government SUV pulled up to my curb, and out stepped a man I recognized from every televised local budget hearing, Councilman Richard Graves. He was the head of the city's zoning and planning committee, a man who had held his seat for 20 years through a combination of polished charisma and behind-the-scenes intimidation. He didn't walk up to my door. He walked straight to the edge of my newly reclaimed garden, staring at the orange steel bollards with a look of intense, clinical annoyance. I walked out to meet him, my arms crossed, already sensing the specific flavor of the confrontation. "Mr. David," Graves said, his voice a deep, practiced baritone that exuded a false sense of fatherly concern. "I've been reviewing the recent topographical adjustments to this cul-de-sac. While I understand you had a private dispute with the former HOA president, the city has some very serious concerns about the structural integrity of the public utility easements beneath the land you've reclaimed." I raised an eyebrow, leaning against one of my bollards. "The easements are perfectly fine, Councilman. I've personally audited the sewage and electrical conduit paths. They remain within the public right-of-way, exactly as they were in 1978. Graves didn't blink. He pulled a thick, official-looking document from his leather portfolio. "The City Planning Office disagrees. We've issued an emergency declaration of eminent domain for this specific 60-foot strip of land. We've determined that a new municipal drainage artery needs to be installed immediately to prevent localized flooding. You'll be compensated at the assessed tax value, of course, which, given the recent demolition, is practically pennies." My blood ran cold, but not out of fear. It was the absolute, unadulterated clarity of a man who has just spotted a massive engineering flaw. Eminent domain is the ultimate weapon of a corrupt official. It allows the government to seize private land for public use. Graves wasn't trying to fix a drainage issue. He was trying to take the land back so he could pave over whatever secrets Brenda had been hiding for him. If the city owned the land, my private survey and my forensic audit would be legally neutralized. "You have 72 hours to remove these bollards and vacate the reclaimed lot, David," Graves stated, his eyes turning as hard as flint. "If you interfere with a municipal infrastructure project, I'll have the city attorney file criminal obstruction charges against you by Monday morning." He turned on his heel and walked back to his SUV, leaving me standing in the middle of my garden. But Richard Graves had made the same fatal mistake that every arrogant bureaucrat makes. He assumed that because he held the office, he held the knowledge. He didn't realize that as a senior civil engineer, I didn't just look at maps. I looked at the history of the Earth itself. I spent the next 24 hours in the basement of the city archives, but I wasn't looking at property deeds this time. I was looking at the 1992 municipal infrastructure bonds. I spent the night cross-referencing the construction logs of the very drainage artery Graves claimed was so critical. What I found was a digital and physical trail of corruption that made Brenda's embezzlement look like a lemonade stand. In 1992, Richard Graves had awarded a $3 million contract to a construction firm owned by his own brother-in-law to install the main sewer and drainage lines for this entire subdivision. But the actual engineering logs showed that they had skipped nearly 40% of the required materials, using substandard, industrial-grade plastic piping instead of the reinforced concrete specified in the city's safety codes. They had pocketed nearly $2 million in taxpayer money, and they had used Brenda, as the HOA president, to ensure that no one ever dug deep enough to find the ticking time bomb beneath our feet. The drainage artery Graves wanted to install wasn't a new project. It was a desperate attempt to excavate and replace the collapsing, illegal pipes before they caused a massive sinkhole that would expose his 30-year-old crime. He wasn't just trying to take my land. He was trying to bury the evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud. I didn't call the city attorney. I didn't file a counter-injunction. I grabbed my ground-penetrating radar equipment and headed back to the cul-de-sac. I was going to give the councilman exactly what he wanted, a very detailed look at the infrastructure. The 72-hour deadline set by Councilman Graves was meant to be a psychological countdown to my surrender. But for me, it was a window of opportunity to synchronize my final strike. I didn't spend Friday hiding behind lawyers. I spent it on the phone with a former colleague who worked as a lead investigative producer for the city's most-watched news channel. I didn't offer her a story. I offered her a live, scientific demonstration of a multi-million-dollar taxpayer betrayal. By Saturday morning, the cul-de-sac was no longer a quiet residential street. At 10:00 a.m., Councilman Graves arrived with 2 city-marked backhoes and a crew of nervous-looking municipal workers, ready to forcibly seize my land under the guise of emergency drainage repairs. But waiting for him on my front lawn was a professional camera crew and a high-fidelity ground-penetrating radar GPR, rig mounted on a specialized cart. I stood on the edge of the orange steel line I had drawn, looking at Graves with a cold, unshakable calm. "Mr. David," Graves barked, his face turning a deep, angry shade of crimson as he saw the news camera. "This is a restricted municipal work zone. You are interfering with a critical public safety project. I'm ordering the police to remove you and your equipment immediately." I didn't flinch. I turned to the news reporter and then back to Graves, my voice projecting with the authority of a man who has spent 15 years testifying before state planning boards. "Councilman, according to the emergency declaration you signed, this critical project is necessary because the city claims the 1992 drainage artery beneath this land is failing. As a licensed senior civil engineer, I am simply conducting a non-invasive, independent structural audit of that artery using GPR technology. Since this is still my private property until the final eminent domain compensation is paid, I have every legal right to document the current state of the infrastructure." Graves tried to step toward me, but the news camera was already rolling, live streaming the feed directly to their digital platforms. I began pushing the GPR cart slowly across the reclaimed lot, directly over the path where the 1992 blueprints claimed a 30-inch reinforced concrete pipe was buried. I looked at the high-definition monitor mounted on the cart, which was being mirrored onto a massive flat screen I had set up on my porch for the neighbors and the camera crew to see. "Look at the screen, Councilman," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the machinery. A reinforced concrete pipe of that size would show a distinct, high-density hyperbolic reflection. But what we are seeing here is a low-density, irregular signature at a depth of 6 feet. That's not concrete. That's high-density polyethylene, commercial-grade plastic piping that was never rated for a subdivision of this scale. The news reporter leaned in, pointing her microphone at the monitor. "Are you saying the city used substandard materials, David?" I nodded, my eyes never leaving Graves, who was now visibly trembling, his hand reaching up to adjust a collar that suddenly felt far too tight. "It's worse than that. The 1992 municipal bond records show that the city paid for $3 million worth of reinforced concrete. Someone pocketed the difference between the price of concrete and the price of cheap plastic. And because those plastic pipes have been crushing under the weight of the soil for 30 years, they are currently 70% collapsed. That's the drainage issue Graves is so desperate to bury. If he digs this up without a neutral observer, he can swap the pipes and destroy the evidence of his family's 30-year-old crime." Graves let out a choked, desperate laugh. "This is a technical glitch. Your equipment isn't calibrated. This is an outrageous conspiracy theory." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a second tablet, displaying the forensic audit I had performed on the HOA's secret reserve account. "Then perhaps you can explain Exhibit B, Councilman. During my audit of Brenda's embezzlement, I found a recurring consulting fee of $5,000 a month paid to a shell corporation called Graves Global Consulting. Brenda wasn't just stealing for herself. She was paying you protection money from the neighbors' dues to ensure that city inspectors never checked the structural integrity of this neighborhood. You weren't just a corrupt politician. You were Brenda's silent partner in crime." The crowd of neighbors, who had been watching in stunned silence, erupted into a roar of fury. Graves looked around, realized he was surrounded by cameras, angry taxpayers, and the undeniable scientific proof of his betrayal. He didn't order the backhoes to start digging. He turned, pushed past his own crew, and practically ran back to his SUV, fleeing the scene as the reporter chased him down the street with a barrage of questions. The emergency declaration had just become a confession. The battle for the land was over. Now, the battle for the city had begun. The live news broadcast hadn't even finished airing when the physical world decided to provide the final, undeniable testimony against Councilman Richard Graves. As Graves' SUV sped away from the cul-de-sac, leaving his confused municipal crew behind, the heavy vibration from the idling backhoes proved to be the final straw for the decaying, substandard infrastructure beneath our feet. I felt the tremor first, a deep, rhythmic shudder through the soles of my boots that an experienced engineer recognizes as the structural death rattle of unstable earth. "Everyone, get back! Move the equipment now!" I screamed, grabbing the news reporter by the arm and pulling her toward my porch. The neighbors scrambled back just as a terrifying, subterranean groan echoed through the street. The exact spot where the GPR had identified the collapsed plastic pipes suddenly buckled. With a sound like a thunderclap, the asphalt where the city's backhoes were parked disintegrated. A massive, 15-foot-wide sinkhole opened up in the middle of the cul-de-sac, swallowing the front half of one of the municipal trucks in a cloud of dust and ruptured water lines. The cheap, illegal plastic pipes I had exposed minutes ago were now visible to the entire city, twisted and shattered like dry twigs under the weight of the street. It wasn't just a technical failure. It was a physical manifestation of 30 years of political greed. By the time the dust settled, the State Bureau of Investigation, SBI, and federal agents from the Department of Justice were already mobilized. Because the 1992 infrastructure project had been funded by federal municipal bonds, the fraud wasn't just a local issue. It was a federal crime. While the news crew captured the image of the literal hole in the city's heart, a tactical team was already breaching the doors of Graves' private estate and his office at City Hall. They didn't just find the Graves Global Consulting files. They found the Red Ledger, a physical notebook Graves had kept for decades, documenting every kickback, every bribe, and every substandard contract he had approved for his inner circle. He had been so arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchability, that he had kept a written record of his own destruction. At 4:00 p.m., while I stood on my porch looking at the wreckage of the street, my lawyer called with the final update on the eminent domain threat. "It's over, David," he said, his voice filled with a rare sense of genuine satisfaction. The state attorney general has issued an emergency stay on all of Graves' planning committee decisions. The eminent domain declaration on your land has been officially rescinded as a fraudulent instrument of a criminal conspiracy. Your property is secure. In fact, the state is likely going to offer you a massive settlement to avoid a secondary lawsuit regarding the municipal negligence that caused the sinkhole. I hung up the phone and looked across the street at the hollowed-out shell of Brenda's mansion and the gaping hole in the road. The suburban queen was in a cell, and the city king was currently being processed in a federal holding facility, facing charges of racketeering, embezzlement, and public endangerment that would ensure he never saw the sun as a free man again. The neighbors, many of whom had been bullied by Graves and Brenda for a generation, began to gather at the edge of the sinkhole. They weren't looking at me with fear or suspicion anymore. They were looking at me with a profound, quiet respect. I had used my skills not to build a monument to my own ego, but to dismantle the monuments built on lies. As the sun began to set over Oakwood Heights, casting long shadows over the orange steel bollards that still marked my rightful territory, I realized that the line I had drawn in the sand hadn't just saved my house. It had cleared the way for a new foundation, one built on truth, engineering precision, and the cold, hard reality that no matter how much dirt you pile on top of a lie, the earth always eventually spits it back out. The silence that returned to the Oakwood Heights cul-de-sac in the months following the Great Sinkhole was different than the fearful, suffocating quiet of the Brenda era. It was the peaceful, grounded silence of a foundation that had finally been set right. Reconstruction of our street was not handled by the city's corrupt planning committee. It was overseen by a state-appointed engineering task force, and as the lead affected property owner and a senior civil engineer, I was granted the legal right to personally approve every single blueprint. The cheap plastic pipes were excavated and hauled away as evidence in a federal racketeering trial, replaced with high-density, reinforced concrete that will outlast everyone currently living on this block. Councilman Richard Graves didn't just lose his seat, he lost everything. The federal investigation uncovered $42 million in misappropriated municipal funds over his 20-year career. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His assets were frozen to pay back the taxpayers he had robbed, and his name was scrubbed from every city building it had ever graced. Brenda, facing the combined weight of state embezzlement charges and civil lawsuits from every neighbor she had ever illegally fined, pleaded out to a 10-year sentence. Her luxury mansion, or what was left of it after my surgical demolition, was eventually seized by the bank, leveled to the ground, and the lot was sold at a public auction. I bought that lot for a fraction of its value, not to build another mansion, but to ensure that no tyrant could ever occupy that space again. I turned the entire area into a permanent neighborhood park and wildlife sanctuary, legally deeded as a perpetual easement that can never be built upon or governed by an HOA. The Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association is officially dead, replaced by a voluntary community watch with zero power to issue fines and zero interest in the color of a man's curtains. As for me, the state settlement for the municipal negligence and the illegal eminent domain attempt was more than enough to fund my early retirement from the corporate world. I still have my orange steel bollards, but they aren't there to keep people out anymore. They are now integrated into the park's entrance as decorative pillars, a quiet, metallic reminder of the line that was drawn and the corruption that was crushed. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit on my porch with a glass of bourbon and look out at the children playing where Brenda's master suite used to be. The earth is level, the pipes are solid, and the property lines are undisputed. My name is David. They tried to steal my home and bury me under a corrupt city council, so I audited their history, exposed their fraud, and reclaimed my land inch by agonizing inch. If you enjoyed this epic battle for suburban justice and the total demolition of a corrupt political machine, you need to smash that like button and subscribe to the Revenge Room. We bring you the most satisfying, high-stakes karma stories that YouTube has to offer. Never let a bureaucrat intimidate you, always verify your own survey, and remember, the strongest structure you can ever build is one founded on the truth. See you in the next one. The final chapter of the Oakwood Heights War wasn't written in a courtroom or on a construction site. It was written in the quiet, peaceful smiles of the neighbors who no longer had to look over their shoulders. 1 year after the Great Sinkhole, the cul-de-sac had been completely transformed. The massive, gaping wound in the earth had been filled with reinforced concrete and topped with high-grade, porous asphalt designed to last a century. But more importantly, the psychological wound left by Brenda and Graves had finally begun to heal. I stood on my porch on a warm July evening, watching the sunset cast a golden glow over the Sovereign Garden, the park I had built on the land that used to house Brenda's master suite. There are no HOA signs here. There are no lists of prohibited behaviors. There is only a small, bronze plaque at the entrance that simply reads, "Built on truth, dedicated to the community." I often think about the irony of it all. Brenda tried to use the law to steal my home, only to lose hers because she didn't realize she was living on my soil. Graves tried to use the city's power to bury his crimes, only to have the very earth he cheated collapse beneath his feet. They both shared the same fatal flaw. They believed that money and titles could override the fundamental laws of engineering and integrity. I recently received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Brenda had attempted to file for an early compassionate release, citing the emotional trauma of losing her social standing. The request was denied within 24 hours. She will serve every single day of her 10-year sentence, far away from the designer kitchens and heated pools she stole from the taxpayers. Graves is currently serving his 15-year stretch in a high-security facility, where his only planning committee is the rotation of the laundry room. His name has become a cautionary tale in City Hall, a permanent stain that serves as a deterrent for the next generation of ambitious bureaucrats. My firm, now specializing in forensic infrastructure auditing, has become the go-to agency for cities across the country looking to root out industrial decay and systemic corruption before the sinkholes start to open. We don't just fix pipes, we fix the systems that allowed them to fail. I turned my expertise into a shield for the common homeowner, making sure that no quiet resident ever has to face a tyrant like Brenda alone again. I walked down my driveway, past the orange steel bollards that are now covered in climbing jasmine, and sat on the bench in the center of the garden. The property lines are clear, the foundations are solid, and the neighborhood is finally free. My name is David. They tried to build an empire of lies on my private land, so I dismantled their lives and turned their throne into a garden. If you've stayed with us through this 10-part saga of suburban warfare and total legal destruction, you are the reason we keep telling these stories. Smash that like button, subscribe to the Revenge Room, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of satisfying karma. In the comments, tell me, what would you have done if you found out your neighbor's house was on your land? This has been the story of the Oakwood Heights rebirth. Remember, Don't just build a house, build a legacy that can withstand the truth. See you in the next story.